I'm really delighted to be here today. My name is Alexis Fosler. In my prior life, I was a C-suite executive for businesses here in Asia, but I'm also an addict in long-term recovery and have significant decades of experience of addiction. Some years ago, I retrained and I now have a master's in counseling. I completed my 300-hour practicum with a gentleman called 𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏, who's one of the top experts in Asia on addiction psychiatry. And then I went on to complete a Master's of Science in International Addiction Studies at medical schools in the US and the UK. I now work independently as a full-time addictions and trauma therapist, and I'm also responsible for running a recovery program at a new rehab center in Sydney, Australia. So I'm really looking forward to giving the talk, and we're going to start, if we can move slides, just to the agenda. And really, the lecture today is intended to give you a very brief understanding of addiction, what it is, why we have it, and how we can treat it. We're going to have a lot of time at the end for questions, so please don't be shy and perhaps write them down as we go. So next slide, please. So there's a really simple definition of addiction that I quite like, and it's given here by a gentleman called Dr. 𝗑𝗏𝗁. And some of you may know his books. He's written on ADHD, a book called The Scattered Brain, Addiction, a book called 𝗠𝗵𝗂𝘁, and many, many more. So his definition is that an addiction is any behavior that provides an individual with temporary relief or pleasure that the person craves when they do not have it, that causes them to suffer with negative consequences, and that they cannot give up. So it might be useful to remember this particular. It might be useful to remember this particular definition as we move through the presentation. Okay, so next slide is the models of addiction. And there are a lot of ways to answer the question, what is addiction? Now, none of these models is completely correct. And that's really because recent developments in neuroscience, our understanding of neuroscience, our ability to actually MRI the brain, are increasingly building our understanding of addiction. So there's a lot more for us to learn, but these models really take us through the essential models, many of which are still in use today. And if we could move to the next slide. So the first model is what we call the moral model. And that's really based on the following, that addiction results from an individual's moral failing, from a weakness in their character. And according to this perspective, those of us who struggle with addiction lack self-discipline, willpower, and our behaviors are because of poor choices that we've made or personal irresponsibility. Now, this model was very, very common, I would say, several decades ago. It's still employed by many. The benefits of the model is that there is an emphasis on personal responsibility, which is necessary in addiction treatment. But the disadvantages include the stigma of addiction, the marginalization of people who have addiction, the criminalization and the institutionalization of those who are addicted, and more importantly, the stigma and the challenges that poses for people who are looking to get treatment. This model, we now know, also doesn't take into account the importance of genetic, neurobiological, and environmental factors. So as an example, we now know that genetic factors could be accountable for up to 40 to 60% of the risk for developing addiction. And that neurobiological changes in the brain's reward system actually have implications in the development of drug-seeking behavior. We also know that adverse childhood experiences, mental health, social environment contribute significantly to addiction, and in some cases can increase the risk of addiction by 4,600%, right? So these studies have been done and they are very well developed. Next slide. So the next slide, I think some of you may know, and this was a kind of a more recent development, I would say, which is the disease model. And that really considers addiction as a chronic, progressive, relapsing disease of the brain, which is influenced by genetics, by the environment, and other developmental factors. But we now know, because of our recent understanding of the brain and our ability to image and so forth, we also know that there is a genetic component. It does require some study. So it doesn't completely take into account all of the things that we know today about addiction. But the benefits of this model is that it emphasizes the role of biology in addiction, right? And that means that there have been really significant advancements in the treatment and recovery and the development, for example, of pharmacological treatments. So those are medications that target specific neurotransmitters in the brain and really address the underlying biological mechanisms. So we're going to talk about them a little bit more later on, but really that's things like buprenorphine, naltrexone, disulfiram, methadone, right, which are basically block the receptor for pleasure. But this is really important when we think about the benefits of this model, because what it does is it recognizes that this is something that's chronic. It needs a long-term intervention, long duration, and that it needs comprehensive care because it is a relapsing disorder. We move to the next slide. So this model is now much more, I suppose, considered. And really, it combines the elements of the disease model that we've just been through and the trauma model that we're about to go through. So this model, the biopsychosocial model, really acknowledges the biological dimension of addiction, as I said, via tests like MRI scans, as well as the psychological and the social dimensions. So the model states that addiction is a complex and dynamic interplay between an individual's genetic makeup, their psychological characteristics, and their social environment. So what are the benefits of having this model? Well, it's nuanced. It recognizes that no single factor can account for the development or maintenance of addiction. But from an intervention perspective, this is quite complex, because essentially now we have to look at a really, really complex and difficult interplay of our biology, our psychology, and our social environments. And then we have to put those interventions into practice over a long period of time. It also means that it can downplay the role that personal responsibility, personal action has in the treatment of addiction. So if we move to the next slide, this is the model that really, from a personal perspective, I find works the best. And increasingly, we see it being utilized in a number of rehabs across the world. So this is the trauma model, or some people call it the stressor response model. And really what it does is it looks at addiction as a reaction to extreme stress, something that's brought about by trauma, by PTSD. So individuals under this premise really turn to drugs in order to numb themselves from the memories or from the emotions that are triggered by extreme stress. And I think all of us on this call know, and particularly post-pandemic, we know what extreme stress feels like. In fact, it's becoming so popular that we actually sometimes refer to addictions or substance use or behavioral disorders as disorders of extreme stress. So you may see something called DESNOS, DESNOS, disorders of extreme stress, not otherwise specified. And that would fall into this model. So the benefit of the model is that actually what it treats is the interventions are really useful no matter what's going on in our life, right? So no matter what's going on in our life, we target that emotional sobriety rather than simply sobriety from the drug. It also takes into account one of the greatest predictors of addiction, which is what we call adverse childhood experience. It takes into trauma, again, a very, very, very significant predictor of addiction, and also is useful in treating all kind of maladaptations, maladaptive behaviors. So those might be process disorders, so binge eating, gambling, porn, or they might be substance use. But the disadvantages, again, are this means that treatment is complex because we have to also address not only all of those dimensions, but also many of the co-occurring disorders that go along with trauma and with PTSD. And that's things like anxiety or depression, for example, just one of many. If we move to the next slide, I think now that we kind of understand, or I hope we have a little bit of understanding about the models of addiction, let's talk about the terminology, because this also comes up. So when we talk about addiction, addiction, it actually encompasses two things. One is substance use disorder that we're going to go into detail on this slide, but the other is what we call behavioral disorders. And those are also addictions, right? So those would include gambling, eating, exercising, dieting, shopping, porn, sex, gaming, internet, right? So in the US, alcohol use disorder, or AUD, is the most common addiction. But in Singapore, we actually very frequently come across behavioral disorders like gaming, pornography, and gambling. So those would also be considered addictions. We also increasingly use the terminology substance use disorder, or SUD. And the reason for that is it's considered a little bit less stigmatizing than addiction. And substance use actually then further kind of defines the substance from the behavioral disorders. So as defined in one of our diagnostic and statistical manuals, there are 10 categories under substance use disorder, and those are mind and mood altering drugs, and they are here. So alcohol, a big one for many of us. Caffeine, I'm pretty sure most of us struggle with that. Cannabis. Then there are hallucinogens, there are inhalants, there are opioids, sedatives, hypnotics or anti-anxiolytics, stimulants like amphetamine and cocaine, and also, of course, a big one, which is tobacco. So if we could move to the next slide. So for the remainder of the session, we're going to talk about substance use disorder because the behavioral addictions are really beyond the scope of this lecture. But it's enough for you guys to know that essentially addiction is substance use and behavioral. And here I'm going to give you another definition of substance use disorder, which is in what we call the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And you can see that definition here. So an important characteristic of substance use disorders is an underlying change in brain circuitry that can persist beyond detoxification, particularly in individuals with severe disorders. The behavioral effects of these brain changes may be exhibited in frequent relapses and intense drug craving when individuals are exposed to drug-related stresses or stimuli. These persistent drug effects benefit from long-term approaches to treatment. So what this really is saying is that there are significant changes in the brain circuitry, and that those may persist even after you've maintained sobriety from the substance. So we look at 11 diagnostic criteria when we look at clients in addiction, and these come again from the DSM-5, which is what all the insurance companies use, or most of them, for their diagnostic criteria. And most of these are around 4 quadrants, if you like. One is impaired control. So does this person use, or do you use more than you wanted to? Have you tried to stop and not been able to do so? Then there are negative consequences. So we talk about jails, institution, death, right? Typically, we find that people who are using on a frequent basis will have problems with work, problems with family, problems with health, for example. Then there are hazardous behaviors. And what that really means is, are you, engaging in risky sex, for example, when you're under the influence? Are you driving when you're intoxicated? Are you putting yourself in backstreet alleys which may not be safe at night in order to score your drugs? And finally, the health consequences, which obviously increase as our addiction increases, and whether or not individuals have experienced what we call tolerance, so an increased ability to digest a drug without really feeling the euphoria, or a withdrawal, which is very severe. So if we move on to slide number 12. So very quickly, what we've learned about treatment is that there are multiple dimensions that require treatment, and there's multiple symptomology, right? So what that means is different types of treatment and treat different kinds of aspects of addiction. We also know that relapse potential is important to consider, and that's something that requires ongoing treatment, ongoing intervention. Next slide. So knowing that, and I think this is what you guys may be interested in, there are some common interventions that many of you will already know about. So one is community support. So there are many, many community groups like AA, which is Alcoholics Anonymous, NA, Narcotics Anonymous. I think there's Al-Anon, which is for family members of alcoholics. There's Binge Eating Anonymous. There's Overeaters Anonymous. There's pretty much everything available, either in person or online. And we find that those group therapy interventions that provide really supportive communities and a structured framework to people to live their lives by does allow people, it's one of the most effective interventions for achieving and maintaining sobriety. But we also know that therapeutic interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, like dialectical behavioral therapy, family therapy, mindfulness therapy, motivational therapy, all of these therapeutic interventions have been shown to be, in various different capacities, have been shown to be effective. I think there are some studies, some meta-analysis which suggest that cognitive behavioral therapy of all of them is perhaps the most beneficial, but all of these interventions do work and we do use them. And then, of course, there's a pharmacology, which again is beyond the scope, but this is where we talk about some of those medications that were essentially made when the disease model came up. So there's naltrexone and disulfiram for AUD. There's methadone or buprenorphine for opioids, and withdrawal. Next slide. So I'm going to give you a slightly different view on interventions. And this one comes from the last model that I gave you, which was that stressor response model. And I think this is important because as you guys look at your projects, you could perhaps break down some of the domains in which you or your foreseen clientele are interacting. So the stressor response model, or the trauma-informed model, really states that the environment, our cognitive frameworks, our behavior, and somatic, so the feelings within our bodies, the physiology of our bodies, all impact how we respond to stress. If I could have the next slide. So if I look at the environment as an example, right, we can change our environment. That's something that is within our power to change. And so consequently, screen time, diet, exercise, sleeping, learning, all of these things are things that we can change and that have a positive orientation. We can also change the people, places, and things that we interact with. And again, that's really important because if we are spending all our time in bars, there's a high chance that we will most likely start drinking. We also look at cognition. So the cognition is really the lens through which we interpret stress, but also the lens, that we have a narrative that frames our life. So if we look at CBT as an intervention, that's why it is particularly helpful in aiding people to change their thoughts, to reframe their thoughts, to understand what we call cognitive distortions, which are typically cognitive negative biases, and also understand when they get into what we call threat-based thinking, which can be black and white type thinking, catastrophic thinking, which tends to make our behavior in turn worse. Next slide. And then this behavior, right? We can change our behavior, and that actually affects not only how we think, but it changes how we feel. So if, for example, we set boundaries with family members, we start new behaviors, we go to the gym, we understand that there are consequences for our behaviors, and we start to think about, be aware of, and have a cognitive pause in between the stressor and our response, right? The modification is behavioral. And so that's something that we do also focus on. Slide number 18. And then there's what we call the somatic. So our nervous system is in a constant state of arousal when we're under stress, under threat, right? Our blood pressure goes up, you know, our heart is beating, we might be sweating, right? That's called a state of hyperarousal. And so we know that these particular interventions, called somatic interventions, have the benefit of ramping down, calming our central nervous system, which then results in different responses. If I'm calm, if I'm grounded, if my breathing is deep, I'm much less likely to react to a threat or a stress in a negative way than I am in a considered and beneficial way. So the final slide is the last one. It's an incredibly complex topic. It's a topic I love. I could talk about for hours, but I won't. We've really barely touched the surface, but I do hope that it's given you some context, some kind of pause for thought. I am open to answering any kind of question. No question is, you know, I will be candid and honest and answer as best I can. It's really important to all of us, I think, that you truly understand the subject. And so I'm going to hand it over to the team in Q&A.
Okay, who has the first question? Come on, don't be shy. I'm sure there's stuff that's going on in your head right now. Just ask it. Right? Don't censor yourself.
And we also have Dr. Gabriel in the house as well. So this could be an open-ended question to the experts because they are not dedicated to any teams, unlike the rest of the mentors. So now is the only chance for you to ask these questions publicly.
Yep, Camille. Camille, you can ask your question. I think you're muted. Or you can't unmute yourself. Okay.
Cannot unmute yourself. I really changed the setting.
So, what the lecturer, the presenter shared was about like one part about changing the behaviors, right? So I noticed a lot of like people sharing like on TikTok, many people who have eating disorders, they kind of turn to gymming and then it kind of becomes an addiction, like a gymming addiction. So how can we encourage like trying out changing behaviors, but not like getting addicted to those new habits?
It's a really good question. First of all, I want to just make an aside and say that eating disorders are probably one of the least understood behavioral addictions. And so we treat them kind of correspondingly with as much care and caution as possible. But I think the essence of your question is really, can you swap one addiction for another? And how do you stop doing that, right? And so the answer is absolutely. So, you know, many clients, myself included, we might go from drinking a lot to smoking a lot to taking prescription pills a lot to maybe using illicit substances a lot, and, you know, and maybe doing them all at the same time. And then under periods of extreme stress, we may notice that suddenly, you know, we're also internet shopping a lot, or maybe spending more time online, you know, porn or whatever it might be, right? And so the answer to the question is, what we try and do is we try and change the neural pathways by putting in behaviors, different behaviors, so behaviors that are beneficial, right? That provide the same anticipation of reward, if not more, that over time, the client is more likely to go to than the old behavior. So for example, in an eating disorder, gym or exercise would be a very cautious, we would consider very carefully before we recommended that to somebody with an eating disorder. In fact, highly likely we wouldn't. But your question also kind of talks to the point that if you have a chronically depressed reward system, which we believe that most people who struggle with trauma do, or who struggle with stress do, then you need more reward to replace what you've lost through your drugs or through your alcohol or through your, you know, whatever it is, use. So what that means is if I just suddenly stop drinking, or I suddenly stop doing the activity using math or whatever, I've got a big gap, right? I've got to fill that gap. So I need to learn new behaviors, doing things differently, so my brain still gets the reward, but it gets it from somewhere else. That's a great question.
Mr. Shetty?
Hi, yeah, thank you for sharing. I just have a question regarding peer pressure. So when people, let's say they've done drugs before and they exit a rehab facility, you know, oftentimes they find it hard to break away from their social circles, you know, like, oh, have a spliff with me, have a pint with me. So what advice do you give out to people who, you know, really want to get better, but are finding it difficult to break out of their original social circles that don't promote, you know, positive energy?
That's another really good question. So what you're really talking about is the environment, right? So how do we change that part of our environment, which is what we call interactive, our interaction with people, places, and things? And it's tough, right? But I can guarantee if you go back to your old drug dealing circle, to your old mates who are doing drugs, there's a very high chance that you will go back. So again, we encourage new behavior, new support groups, so things like AA, NA group, you know, whatever it is, things that basically bring you a new tribe, a new support, a new community in order to fill that gap, right? But we usually recommend staying away from people, places, and things that trigger the use, because we know from experience that if nothing changes, nothing's going to change. And the chances are that it will be very difficult for you to remain in those type of circles and maintain both emotional and physical sobriety.
Russell?
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes, Russell.
Okay, so thank you for sharing just now. Also, actually, I just want to ask, right? You mentioned like that there was two different types of disorders that you usually like can tackle with. One is the substance use disorder, the other one is the behavioral disorder, which you mentioned is very often found in Singapore. So actually, I just wanted to ask, like, what's like the fundamental difference in how, like, why someone would end up in a behavioral disorder over a substance disorder? Then why is it that in Singapore's societal case, we are more likely to end up suffering from behavioral disorders as opposed to other types of disorders?
That's a great question. I think it's best answered in terms of what we call heuristics, right? So what I mean by that is if I'm in an environment where alcohol and drugs are freely available, and I have a proclivity, or I have a you know, adverse child experiences, it's most likely that I'm going to turn to some sort of manifestation of addiction, right? I'm going to go to whatever it is that A, works for me, so the thing I've tried that worked, and B, that is accessible to me. So in a culture like Singapore, where, you know, we do have kind of quite significant stigmatization, criminalization of drugs, right? Where many Asians have what we call Asian flush. They lack an enzyme in their systems to break down alcohol. So when they ingest it, they're ingesting poison. So it's not a good feeling for a lot of Asians. It may be that there are certain types of behavior that within the heuristics, within the context of their life, right, might be more available. But the way we treat it, to be honest with you, with some very small exceptions, you know, geared towards maybe eating disorders or sex addiction, because you can't stop eating, right? It's a process disorder. I have to eat. And I should, you know, my biological makeup is that I am designed to procreate and have sex, right? So with some small tweaks, the treatment does not change. It's just that the behavior has changed because of the availability or what we call the heuristics.
Questions from the team, even from the mentors? Quite a fair bit has been covered by Alexis that would give you a hint about how you're going to approach some of your projects, right? So, you know, get the myths and misunderstandings debunked and really tackle the real issues.
I have a question, and this is for both Alexis and Dr. Gabriel as well. So I'm interested in the prevention side of things. Is it possible for the addict to know that in the early stage they are becoming an addict? And what are some ways they can recognize that they are going to be suffering from an addiction?
Well, I mean, I don't know if any of you guys do psychology, but or are familiar with Prochaska and 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙 I'll put it in the notes, but it's Prochaska, Prochaska, and 𝗔𝗚𝗍, 𝗔𝗚𝗍, stages of change model. And really what that says is that there are moments when we're pre-contemplative. So we might know we've got a problem, or we might not really care about having a problem, right? And then contemplative is when we're thinking we might have a problem. Action is when we actually do something about it. So the question you're asking is, how do I incite somebody to change their behavior, but do they even know that they have problematic behavior? And I think that's where the conditioning comes in, right? Because in Singapore, we have a fairly liberal, in terms of ubiquitous kind of laws and so forth, right? So there are consequences for actions. We know what is legal, what is not, right? But I think from an individual perspective, to sort of give somebody signs that they are struggling with addiction. I mean, they'll know because of their health, they'll know because of, you know, whatever's happening around them. But I like to think of it as a kind of a pain equilibrium. You know, I'm only likely to stop when the pain from stopping is less than the pain from not stopping, or the other way around. Do you see what I mean? Like, you know, they talk about rock bottom. You've got to hit your rock bottom, but believe me, you can hit 50 rock bottoms in a row and none of them will do anything. And then suddenly one day, for whatever reason, it makes more sense to get clean than it does. The pain from continuing or having to take this drug is so intolerable that you no longer can do it, afford it, live through it, right? And that's when we start to change.
If I could just add one or two thoughts I have, you find that people who are struggling, some people who are struggling with substances or even process addictions, they tend to be experiencing distress. You know, you may not know that you are having addiction type symptoms, but it is just not pleasurable. At some point, it just becomes not that pleasurable anymore. It becomes something that, you know, when we speak to people who have substance use problems, they don't talk about enjoying it anymore when they take the substance. They just take it so that they don't feel as terrible without it. But there is palpable distress. So I think that is one thing that, even if somebody is not at the point where they say, I have an addiction, but if they are able to recognize that, I'm undergoing some sort of distress in regards to my relationship with this substance or this behavior, that is a signal to pick up. Another signal is that sometimes people may not be aware, but the people around them may be aware. Family, friends, your doctor, they are beginning, your employer, your colleague, your buddy, they are the ones that are picking out certain things, and they are the ones that are sensing that something is not quite right with this person. And that is another signal to pick up as well when people around you are beginning to ask you, are you is something wrong? Are you indulging in something? Is your health taking a turn? Why are you not sleeping as well? Eating, or whatever expressions of concern that they may reveal. So these are two quick responses.
Just following up on that, Gabriel and Alexis as well. Very often, like you said, right, the people closest to you or who are around you may notice certain changes or certain behavior about you that is not right. But the thing is, would it be correct to say that someone who is undergoing substance abuse will likely not be open to any sort of intervention by these people? In fact, it might even seem like they're meddling, they're intruding, yeah, so what's your experience like with stuff like that?
I mean, it can work very well for some. A family intervention is usually not enjoyed by the client, but at some point in time they will recognize the benefit of it. But it can have the opposite effect. So it's very tricky. From my perspective, there's no real right answer, because without the internal motivation to change, because many of these changes are from an internal locus of control, right? I have to be able to affect these changes rather than these things are done to me. It's not a magic bullet. I'm going to have to work incredibly hard at learning new behaviors, learning new cognition, changing my environment. So without that degree of personal accountability and responsibility, it can make it almost impossible to change.
Entirely agree. Yeah, sorry. Just entirely agree with what Alexis is saying. I think families are dual-edged sword, but I think it is about prompting the person suffering from having a substance use disorder enough so that we get the person onto some sort of contemplation about doing something, right? And I think that's the responsibility of the people around to at least say something, even though it's going to be really, really difficult. Yeah.
And not nagging, I guess. Time for one more question, perhaps, Keith.
I have a question.
Anybody?
I hear somebody say she has a question.
Yeah, me. I have a
Trina?
question. Yeah. So thank you for sharing. I would just like to ask for youths who are at risk of drug abuse. They might experience peer pressure and also just wanting to try out because of curiosity. I would like to ask, like, for at-risk youths who know that they are aware that they are like being placed under pressure, and they know the risk that's going to be involved, the consequences as well, and they at the same time they are experiencing tough situations at home, but they do not know who to reach out to, and because they feel like they do not want to worry other people. But how can we show that we will be there for them? Because like just now the previous question was like, it's one thing for the family members to keep asking them whether they're okay and they are not open to share, but how can we make them share to us?
Well, you can't make anyone do anything, is the first thing I would say. Um, so that would be number one. But I think, Gabe, you might be able to answer in terms of, I mean, there are substantial existing resources in Singapore that address some of your questions. I think it's really what you're saying is, do they have access to those public resources, and are they inclined to take advantage of them? Because the resources certainly exist, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Gabe.
Yeah, there are certainly resources. I think we can't force, but what we can do is to, how should I put it, leave the door open. Leave the door open so that if it's almost like this goes beyond a substance use issue. If you're talking about people with anxiety, depression, any mental health, even physical health problems, but they are not at the point where they are ready, willing, or motivated to talk about it, what we can do, people caring and concerned people around the person can do, is really to say that I'll be there. If you are ready to talk, I will be here to listen to you. Leave the door open so that they know that they know who to turn to if and when they are ready to talk to somebody. I think that helps a lot. And of course, if sometimes we don't have all the answers, and I think it's fine to provide the resources or turn them to the relevant resources online, or there are national NAMs that does quite a fair bit of this type of work, or many of the FSCs in Singapore Family Service Centers do have some capability to do this type of work as well. Yeah.
Actually, Dr. Gabriel, right? I think some the previous student spoke about curiosity as one of the triggers, for people to try out drugs. And no matter how I think about that, I can only think of a solution, that is education.
That's right. Because sorry, go ahead.
So I'm just wondering, what is CMB's and NACADA's biggest challenge with education today?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Curiosity comes from a point where there is an information gap, right? If I don't have information about something that I want to know more about, then that gap causes that tension, internal tension, which we call curiosity. And we resolve curiosity by filling that gap, right, with information. Yeah. And in the context of drugs, I can either fill the information by asking people, right? Asking friends, or trying certain things out myself, and then I get those answers. Yeah. So certainly when we talk about information sources, like I mentioned, there are plenty of resources out there. If you were to look at CMB website, there will be a lot of there will be information on in those web portals as well. The idea is this: if we know that substance use can potentially be very damaging, especially for people who have a predilection for an addictive, I put it very bluntly, addictive personality, meaning that they may be very susceptible to addictive behaviors, and it can be very damaging, not just to the individual, but to the person's community, the family, and that as well. Then the sensible way is to provide as much information so that they try to resolve their curiosity, so that they don't even get started and down the path of I don't put it mildly, but I say it's destruction. Yeah.